A question often asked before Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 was whether the candle-lit vigil to commemorate victims of the Tiananmen crackdown would be allowed to continue. Now, 24 years later, the issue is being raised again. The peaceful annual gathering on June 4 usually draws tens of thousands of people to Victoria Park, where they create a sea of flickering candles. It's an impressive sight and a moving memorial to the hundreds, maybe more, killed when China's military crushed student protests in Beijing on June 4, 1989. Since 1990, the vigil has provided the strongest evidence that Hong Kong's freedoms remain intact. It took place every year until the outbreak of COVID-19. But this year's event, planned for Friday, has been banned for the second year running. The police have again cited the public health threat posed by the pandemic. Questions are also being asked about whether the vigil would breach the national security law imposed by Beijing in 2020. The event is organised by the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China, which has long called for an end to China's one-party rule. Some suggest this would constitute subversion. The last vigil, in 2019, attracted 180,000 people, according to organisers. We have not seen gatherings on that scale since the virus struck, but a smaller event could have taken place safely. While risks from new variants of COVID-19 remain, there were no new cases on Thursday and Friday. Performance venues, cinemas and amusement parks can open at 75% capacity. Almost 8,000 football fans attended the climax to the Premier League season at Hong Kong Stadium the other weekend. Government officials have not been prepared to say whether they regard the event as breaching the security law. Chief Executive Carrie Lam said it would depend on what happened at the gathering. But Executive Councillor Ronnie Tong is right to point out that to commit subversion, a person must use force, threat of force, or unlawful means. If the gathering was permitted and participants acted lawfully, it is difficult to see how their presence could be regarded as subversive. The vigil has a special place in the hearts of Hong Kong people. The Tiananmen crackdown on students calling for democracy, economic reform and an end to corruption had a lasting impact on Hong Kong and its relationship with Beijing. The bloodshed came at a time when the final constitutional arrangements were being put in place for Hong Kong's return to China. Many people believed the city's way of life and freedoms would be better protected if the country embraced democracy. Up to 1 million marched in protest in Hong Kong, and the city provided support for the student demonstrators. Beijing, however, viewed this response as subversive. These developments fueled mistrust between Hong Kong and the central government and deepened a political divide which continues to exist today. Protests in the city in 2014 and the civil unrest of 2019 were accompanied by calls for democracy. Beijing's passing of the national security law, meanwhile, was driven by fears that subversives were working with foreign forces to destabilise Hong Kong. We are still living with the fallout from 1989. But we can only learn from the past if we remember it. The candlelight vigil has always been orderly. Last year, 20,000 gathered despite the ban. The police sensibly adopted a tolerant approach. This did not stop leading participants being later jailed for taking part. Any who choose to gather on Friday know they will be taking a risk. Many might opt to light a candle at home instead. The vigil has been the most powerful symbol that Hong Kong's freedoms remain intact. Permitting it to take place is the best way for Beijing to counter criticism that the city's free expression is being suppressed. Next year, there may not be a pandemic to worry about. It is to be hoped that the June 4 vigil will then be allowed to return. This poignant act of remembrance and potent symbol of Hong Kong's freedoms must be allowed to continue.